A procession of weeping Nordic warriors is walking through the streets of the Italian port city of Luna. Their leader, Viking chieftain Hastein, lies beneath a shroud. Around the deceased, the hardened and towering men have adorned themselves with ornate axes and ceremonial swords, adorned with gold and jewels. The day before, Hastein was baptized into the Christian faith by the Bishop of Luna. The Vikings are far from home, and the Catholic Church bishop was eager to fulfill the Vikings' last wish on his deathbed. Now that the mighty chieftain has passed away, a grand Christian funeral awaits in the city's monastery church. The church is packed, and a choir of priests sings Hastein into the realm of death. According to the Norman historian Dudo of St. Quentin, this was what followed. But then, as the body is being carried out to the grave, Hastein suddenly jumps up, draws his sword, and attacks the bishop, who stands with the Bible in his hand. Brutally, the chieftain strikes him down. At that moment, all of Hastein's men draw their weapons. Dudu continues, "It becomes a total massacre with great ferocity. The Vikings kill everyone without exception. Like wolves in a flock of sheep, men, women, and children are mercilessly hacked down, screaming and crying. Soon, Hastine's men burst through the city gates, and hundreds of Vikings stream in behind Luna's tall city walls. In a cunning manner, the chieftain has achieved what he, despite his more than 60 ships and nearly 2,200 men, could not accomplish with the frontal attack. Hastine's daring and cunning plan has worked. He has taken the heavily fortified city of Luna and secured great wealth for himself and his loyal men. And that's, of course, where the inspiration for the scene in the TV show Vikings came from. The story of Hastine's cunning raid on Luna in the year 860 was recorded about 150 years later, and likely exaggerates the actual course of events to some extent. However, there is no doubt that Viking chieftains like Hastein and his comrade Björn Ironside were skilled in the art of cunning warfare. Source descriptions testify that the feared warriors of the North not only secured their victories through brute force, but also by being a notch smarter than their enemies and employing sly tricks without the slightest scruples, just like their trickster god Loki would do. In one example, the Franks have lined up their forces on both sides of the river Seine in order to deny the Vikings a chance to gain a footholding on the riverbanks. Whereupon the Vikings steer their ships to the side with the least number of opposing forces and brutalizing them to pieces. Upon seeing this, the forces on the other side fled in panic, and the Vikings could sail undeterred towards their main goal, the city of Paris. This is Viking history with Magnus. Accounts from chronicles, sagas, and archaeological discoveries reveal that Viking combat training commenced already in childhood. The warrior mentality permeated their entire society, with combat skills and tactics systematically taught to adults and even children as young as 5 or 6 years old. For more information on Viking children and their upbringing, check out my video, What Was It Like to Grow Up in Viking Society? The total population of Scandinavia during the start of the Viking Age was between 800,000 and 900,000 people, so there were not too many people that could participate in these raids. Soon, they developed a consistent raiding pattern that relied heavily on well-planned lightning attacks from the sea. Behind their profitable raids lay extensive preparation, effective reconnaissance, and strategic ingenuity. The Viking longships were the apex of ship technology at the time. They were very fast and could sail in almost any wind direction. The longships could even navigate rivers with depths of less than 1 meter, giving them a reach where no other ship could go. They also used the element of surprise, which was paramount, and assaults almost always began in the early morning. With their ships' shallow drafts, the Vikings could row directly onto the shore like modern amphibious troops do today. This meant that if a merchant ship suddenly discovered a Viking ship on the horizon with many warriors, it was most likely already too late. Upon arrival, the warriors stormed villages or monasteries with boisterous shouts and fierce displays of their gleaming weapons. The Vikings' initial raids in the late 8th century were likely carried out by small groups of people who targeted coastal objectives in hit-and-run raids. This tactic inspired the hit-and-run tactics the Vikings used on land during the 8th and beginning of the 9th century, with the attack on Lindisfarne being the most famous. The objective was to paralyze the opponents with terror, and historical accounts confirm the repeated success of this tactic. And then they would disappear as quickly as they came before any meaningful resistance could be established. In rare instances, when caught off guard by an enemy force, before completing their plundering, the Vikings would disperse into smaller groups and flee in different directions. Eventually, they would regroup at a predetermined location where they could board their boats and proceed to the next target. Blackmail. Blackmail played a pivotal role in the Vikings' plundering strategies. While the main force launched a frontal assault, other warriors encircled the targeted town or monastery, preventing any escape. The Vikings swiftly identified priests, wealthy merchants, and noblemen who could be ransomed for significant sums. They also offered to spare structures of grandeur and symbolic value. For a small fee, the remaining buildings were pillaged and set ablaze, while the surviving inhabitants were taken captive as slaves. Pitched battles. Engaging in open battles was always a risky endeavor, so the Scandinavians preferred to avoid such confrontations. Consequently, the Vikings often resorted to receiving payment in exchange for refraining from attacks. An example of this is the siege of Paris in 886, where the Frankish King Charles the Fat was compelled to abandon his fight against a Viking force, resorting to paying the Vikings 4,000 pounds of silver for peace. This sum was immense, considering that, at the time, a precious weapon like a sword cost 125 grams of silver in the Viking town of Hedeby in Denmark. The extortion money, or the insurance sum depending on who you asked, equated to a whopping 14,500 swords. The Frankish king obtained the necessary funds by increasing taxes in the country, becoming even more unpopular than he had been before, and this would ultimately become his downfall. Paris was attacked by the Vikings a total of 13 times before the Franks hired the Viking, Rollo the Walker, giving him Normandy and a Frankish princess to marry in order to stop the raids. Something he did successfully, and being the founder of the dynasty that would later invade Britain and win the English throne when his descendant William the Bastard won the Battle of Hastings. William the Conqueror, of course. Svein Forkbeard and Olaf Tryggvason also demanded substantial payments. Following their victory at Malden, the two warlords demanded 10,000 pounds of silver from English King Ethelred to abstain from attacking more towns. Just 2 years later, after a couple more plundering raids, the Viking leaders extorted 16,000 pounds from Ethelred. The Vikings showcased not only their battlefield prowess, but also their astute understanding of what would yield the greatest profits. In June 843, Norwegian chieftains Asgeir and Gunnar embarked on a voyage with 67 ships up the Loire River, situated south of Brittany. Their objective was the ancient Roman city of Nantes, enclosed by deteriorating city walls. The news of the hostile fleet reached the city on June 24th, coinciding with the Midsummer's Eve festivities. All the prominent people were present, and gold and riches were there and plentiful, ripe for the taking. Aware of the opportune conditions for a profitable attack, the Vikings chose exactly this day to strike. According to an eyewitness account, a horrific scene unfolded.
Children, clinging to their dead mothers' breasts, drank blood instead of milk. The church's stone floors were stained red with the blood of holy men, and the blood of the innocent dripped from the sacred altar.
These accounts tend to exaggerate the Vikings' inclination for bloodshed. They were more interested in capturing and enslaving individuals rather than killing them. The Vikings did not adhere to disciplined formations or receive explicit orders from a commander during an attack. Sagas mention that the Jarl or king stood at the forefront of the battle. However, their influence in the heat of the battle was limited due to the chaotic nature of the encounter. Nonetheless, specific leadership was unnecessary, as each warrior knew their role and shared a common objective, a clear understanding of their method. and a remarkable level of routine. In big pitched battles, they would line up a center and usually be flanked by 2 more units. The Jarl or king would always stand in the middle, surrounded by the herd, which was the chieftain's retinue, an integral part of the Vikings' military structure.
Heathen
Had an unbreakable bond cantered on their sworn eternal loyalty to the Jarl or king. In return, he would pledge wealth and honor, symbolized by a ceremonious bestowal of a gold ring upon the new retainer's acceptance into the Brotherhood. They were the best warriors and would protect the king during battle, and were often the difference between victory and defeat. However, this sworn allegiance ensured extraordinary discipline in battle, but also became the Vikings' vulnerability. Because unlike modern warfare, where you usually fight for your country, the Vikings didn't have a sense of nationality. Their loyalty was to the Jarl or king, and if he was captured or killed, the Vikings' force would quickly disintegrate and many retainers would flee, and being slaughtered as they ran away. Something we see happening in the Battle of Stamford Bridge. When Harold Hardrade fell to an arrow, so did the entire Viking army. And as military historians can tell you, if a rout starts, everything disintegrates quickly, and even though running is the worst tactical choice you can make, human survival instincts will make you run in the end. Only 24 ships from the fleet of over 300 were needed to carry the survivors away and back to Norway. Nonetheless, as long as the chieftain lived, the Brotherhood fostered immense mutual trust. The men knew they could rely on each other in combat. Even the infamous berserkers, renowned for their ferocity and imperviousness to harm, played a calculated role in the Vikings' assault tactics. Positioned at the forefront, these warriors aimed to instill fear and intimidate the enemy. Check out my video for more on that. They were also very strong. Anyone who has rowed boats half the size of Viking ships understands the necessity of powerful arm and back muscles, which grow stronger and more resilient with frequent rowing. The tactics and strategy employed were straightforward and comprehensible to all. They possessed self-discipline and a strong sense of camaraderie. Those who sailed and rowed together quickly developed these traits. Of course, individual attributes such as fighting spirit, endurance, and fearlessness were also crucial factors, and the Vikings were trained in weapons use from childhood. Once victorious, the Vikings often showed little mercy. Fleeing enemies would be pursued on horseback and killed. Accounts from sagas rarely mention the Vikings torturing or disabling their captives. They would either be killed or enslaved. However, we have examples of shame-stroking where the Vikings would cut off the enemy's genitals in order to humiliate them and keep them as a trophy.
What's that around your neck?
Oh, this is monk's necklace. It's like a trophy I made.
Is that a cock necklace?
Mm-hmm. From the monks.
Whether this happened while the victim was still alive or after they had passed, the sources are silent about, but knowing the Vikings' brutality towards their slaves, it would not be surprising if this happened while the victim was still alive. When battling at sea, the Vikings would tie the ships together in something called tenge. Tengi is a naval tactical description of a war fleet in the Viking Age. The ships were linked together so that they formed a unit on which the warriors could move freely for close combat with the enemy. By tying the ships together, a great defensive feature was achieved, but it also meant that the fleet in question was almost stationed in the same place all the time, with little or no possibility to move or flee. The most famous of these sea battles was the Battle of Svolder, where Olav Tryggvason, king of Norway, was ambushed by an alliance between Svein Forkbeard, the king of Denmark, Olaf Skotkonung, king of Sweden, and Erik Håkonsson's, Jarl of Trondelag. Cunning as they were, Svein Forkbeard conspired with Jarl Sigvald, chief of the Jomsvikings, and the Swedish king to trick Olav Tryggvason into a trap. The Norwegian king sailed south to Vendland to collect his wife Tyra's dowry from King Bolslaus. And here the plot thickens, because Tyra was none other than daughter of the Danish king Harald Bluetooth, and thus the sister to King Sweyn Forkbeard, whom was now ambushing her husband. King Olav had heard rumors of a planned ambush, But Earl Sigvald met him and told him that these rumors were groundless. Whereupon King Olav sent most of his men home and only brought with him 11 ships for the rest of the trip. This betrayal cost King Olav dearly. His 11 ships was ambushed, and now they faced nearly 70 ships with battle-ready warriors. King Olav didn't stand a chance, and his ships were cleared one by one. The last was the famous Ormen Lange, which Jarl Erik captured when Olav in desperation threw himself into the sea. The Vikings were after riches, gold and slaves, and used extortion, violence, and shock raids to achieve this, and that's why they were so successful. The Vikings fought not only for personal glory, but for the prosperity and protection of their communities. They understood the importance of unity, and the bonds they forged on the battlefield were as strong as the swords they wielded. They were born into a warrior culture where you took what was yours openly, and being part of a Viking raid could completely change your life around. You could go from being a poor farmer or work for the local jarl with not much to your name to become a rich and wealthy man, literary overnight. Now you could be the one who hires poor people to work on your newly acquired farm, have slaves, and marry your offspring into a family, which would never have accepted a marriage proposal earlier. You made it, and your life would never be the same again. Thank you for sticking around all the way to the end. Until next time, may the spirit of the Vikings guide you on your own personal quest for triumph. Please smash that like and subscribe buttons, and check out my other videos to see if there are more you find interesting. And I hope to see you in the next one.